Welcome to the first ever edition of Real Estate Services and Transactions, otherwise known as REST. This is a subsidiary of Reals Academy. My name is Oluwafemi Sanusi, and I'm so delighted that you are joining us for this first ever edition. We have a very interesting topic today titled Real Estate Asset as Property. In the house today, we have a seasoned estate surveyor and valuer that is going to join us to talk about this topic. His name is ESV Olaleko Aboderi. He's the lead advisor of Olaleko Aboderi Consulting, a firm of estate surveyors and valuers, and also the director of studies of Reals Academy, a real estate training center here in Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us today.
It's indeed my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go straight into today's topic. I mean, as you know, we're talking about real estate asset as property. To start with, is real estate just like any other type of property?
Well, not really. I think in the first instance, let's look at what property is. Everybody is aware we have property, you have land, you have personal assets, you have cars. But these properties really are classified into two. And the classifications is such that you have what we call personal property,
Okay.
and we have what we call real property.
Okay.
Right? Property is anything that is capable of being owned. That is very, very important. There must be ownership before you can say it's a property.
Okay.
Hence, given that it's important for the concept of ownership to be present, it then means that real estate is different in terms of, as a property from all other properties. And real estate assets are classified as a real property. So
Okay.
they have their own, real estate assets has their own, its own peculiarity,
Okay.
which distinguished it from other personal property.
Okay.
And these features are very, very important. They make real estate to be a unique asset compared to other personal property.
Okay. Now, given that, I want you to just talk about the categories of properties that we have.
In terms of categories, we have personal property
Okay.
and we have real property. Personal property are things that they are tangible assets that you can move around with.
Okay.
So, and what makes them personal property is that aspect of movability.
Okay.
You can move around with it. It's always something that possession and ownership are the same.
Okay.
But when you talk about real property, you are talking about assets that relates to realty,
Okay.
that relates to real tangible assets,
Okay.
that has elements of fixity.
Okay.
It must have something to do with land
Okay.
as a natural gift of nature.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is real estate.
And you mentioned a valid point when you said that unlike other properties, real estate cannot be moved
Yes.
around. So that's what makes it that's what outlines the peculiarity of real estate. Okay. Now I wanted to talk about the advantages of real estate being fixed in terms of the fixity of real estate.
Is it to start with, when you mentioned peculiarities of real estate is actually right more than fixity. But before talking about all other ones, let me mention about fixity, the advantages. Fixity has a lot of advantages.
Okay.
Right? The first thing is that fixity makes real estate assets to be permanently attached to a location.
Okay.
And that attachment, for example, on the part of revenue generation,
Okay.
fixity contributes to real estate features as being a suitable taxable asset.
Okay.
Because it's an asset that is fixed.
Okay.
Equally, it makes real estate to lend itself readily as a viable instrument
Okay.
for collateral.
Okay.
If you are to use assets to collateralize loan,
Okay.
real estate is very, very good because of that aspect of fixity.
Okay.
However, just as it has the advantages of, in terms of fixity, it has a lot of disadvantages too.
Okay.
All these disadvantages, they are not killing if they could be managed. The only thing about the disadvantages are that the average investor should register those disadvantages in his mind and ensure that measures are taken against it. Because of fixity of real estate, investment peculiarity is very, very unique compared to other properties. For example, if there is a wrong investment in terms of supply of goods in a location, you can easily move such goods to another location where there is demand for it. But when it has to do with real estate, so long the asset is done, the investment is done in a particular location. If that location happens to be a wrong location for that type of investment, it's a permanent thing. You cannot move it. It's not an asset that you can claim to say, yes, I can move it from area of relative slum in the market to area where there is boom. So investors need to pay attention to that. Apart from that too, because of fixity, it's all about location, location, and location. So, and that determines value. That determines performance of the real estate. In equally, it goes a long way to affect what we call market maturity, because everything is all about location. And because it's all about location too, real estate investment or real estate asset and market is totally stratified. So you cannot generalize real estate information, for example, across all locations. This is the implication of the fixity. Now, going beyond that, in terms of peculiarities, real estate asset has so many peculiarities other than fixity. For example, I mentioned earlier that personal assets, you can always move around with it. That's correct. But land, you cannot move around with land. That's correct. And real estate asset is anything that relates with land, whether in its natural order or in its secondary order. I mean, whether it's in its developed order or its undeveloped state. So that is real estate. You can move around with it. Then, equally, land as a geographical space, in whatever state it is, cannot be owned. It's not capable of being owned. It then means that there must be an element that handcuffs ownership. That element that handcuffs ownership is what we call right in land or interest in land. Now, look at that expression, right in land or interest in land. Okay? What that means is that an interest that subsists in a particular parcel of land, or an interest that pertains to a particular land. Now, by implication, it means that real estate asset as a property is an amalgamation. Right? They are a combination of two elements, the physical and the abstract, right? Or let's say the corporate hereditament and the incorporate. The two have to coexist before real estate asset can be seen as property. If the two are not coexisting, then the concept of property will be missing. Because land, geographical space, does not have ability to anchor ownership. Whereas what can anchor ownership is the bundle of rights, the interest. And that interest cannot subsist in a vacuum. It has to relate to a geographical space. So the two together must coexist. Now the coexistence of the two, right? The amalgamation, the synchronization of the two, coming as an entity, as a unit, is regarded as proprietary land units. That is an expression that actually appropriately describes real estate asset as a property, proprietary land units. A geographical space to which a bundle of rights or a right in land pertains. And that right in land must necessarily subsist in that land and must necessarily be vested in an individual before such an individual can lay claim of ownership. Okay, so that is another aspect of this peculiarity. And because I said it's supposed to be a PLU, the land and the interest that exists in it, that interest is abstract. The land is tangible. It's a physical thing. It's what you can see and touch. But the interest that subsists in it is abstract. It's intangible. The only thing is that as it is as intangible asset, it has space dimension and it has time dimension. Okay? It must relate to geographical space, and that space dimension is cubic in space.
Can you please explain a bit more on that?
Yeah, talking about cubic in space is the moment a right in land is vested in an individual. That individual has right over the surface of the land. And that right is not limited to that surface. He has rights deep down the heart. That is the subjacent. to a depth that's beyond human imagination.
Okay.
And again, it has the right far above to the atmosphere. That is the superjacent. Better. So equally, it has time dimension. Because it's a right in land. That right in land has what we call tenor. Tenor can be in perpetuity.
That talks about duration.
Duration. It can be in perpetuity. That is still a measure of time.
That's correct.
Right? And it can be a term in land. That is lease. That is for a period of time, a determinable period. So these are peculiarities. And you see, that peculiarity of time dimension is very, very important because, for example, if you buy a car, as you are using your car, the useful life of that car is running with your time, with your rights in the car. The moment the useful life gets exhausted, of course, you resort to scrap. But because land is indestructible, one's right in land can run off and the land is still existing. You can see the implication. So investors really need to pay attention to the peculiarity of real estate asset as a property.
Now, I mean, you mentioned something about fixity. This is on a lighter note actually, because I think I imagine if land was movable, people that have lands in the suburb would like to move their properties to the prime areas.
Of course.
I mean, with that, you have congestion.
As a matter of fact, I would have moved my land in my village to Lagos.
Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the implications of this peculiarity of real estate.
The implication is really much and is for investors to really be careful. You see, real estate in transactions involves a lot of intricacies. And so real estate decision has to be a guided decision. If you miss it at planning, at conceptual stage, one can really suffer for it. In fact, it can be a colossal loss. So now, the implication, for example, let me just create a scenario.
Okay.
The first thing is somebody wants to buy a parcel of land and you are taking investment decision. You are put in place in respect of that parcel of land. You fence the land. All of a sudden to realize that you don't have rights in that land. You have not been properly vested with the rights that subsist in that land. Such a person cannot be cannot sustain its ownership. So it's always important for investors to first of all realize that real estate asset has peculiarities. And these peculiarities then means that not only physical assets you are acquiring. In fact, you are not acquiring physical assets. It's the right in land that you are acquiring. So acquiring that right in land, it then means that investors should equally have to confirm what type of rights he will be vested in if he buys such land. And what is the authority, the transferability of that right to him, the authority to equally transfer to him is very, very important. And what I mentioned that this bundle of rights or the interest in land has time dimension. With that time dimension, it's equally important for an investor to determine or assess what is the time dimension of the right that is to acquire. An investor will feel that he's acquiring a parcel of land for his lifetime, but only to realize that he has only bought just a few years. And the moment that right runs off, right, his investment interest is at jeopardy. Because the moment you do not have a subsisting right in land, it then means that your ownership has ceased to exist. And again, that type of interest in land, the interest in the land we are talking about, represents a bundle of rights. That bundle of rights can be separated. Sub-rights can be created from the bundle of rights. So you can have what we call the absolute right, so to say the freehold. Out of that, sublease can be created. Out of that, lease can be created, sublease can be created, and so on and so forth. So an investor should ordinarily pay attention to that one. And again, in terms of the value and the marketability of real estate investment, the nature of interest in land goes a long way to affect the value of the property and the marketability of the property. If there are some interests in land, for example, that are not easily transferable, when we get to that, we'll be discussing that. And the nature of the interest in land or the tenure, the unexpired term, will go a long way to determine what value the property will attract. And again, what will be the desirability of market participants for that type of property. And you will agree with me, and just like Fiwa will agree with me, that when demand for a property is king, right, value tends to go up. Because that's simple in economics, right? Now, if for demand to be king or to go up, there must be desire. It must be a property that is of keen demand, of keen, people are so desire of it. So part of what creates value in real estate is what we call desirability. Relative scarcity is there, and transferability is there. All these, they are affected by interest in land. If the interest in land is not ascertainable, or that the interest in land is of short duration, it will affect the desire for it. If the interest in land is not ascertainable, or there is no nexus in terms of who is transacting and who is transferring what, there will be problem of transferability. So all these two tends to affect value. They are established principles in real estate. Just as in basic economics, we know that where there is keen demand, price will go up. Where the demand is low, it will force price down. So it's important for an investor, a buyer, to identify clearly the type of interest that he or she is to acquire. When you have that, then you are sure of the nature, your decision to invest or not to invest.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a very valid point, talking about right. And I think usually when there's a case of conflict in terms of ownership, when people take themselves to court, that's usually what the court tries to establish, that who has the right on that property, regardless of the physical, attributes or whatever is on that land.
Because what is capable of being owned is the right in land. It's not the physical or the tangible parts. The component that is capable of ownership is that right in land. And that's what the court will look out for. Court will look at who is actually entitled to that right. And there are a lot of factors that will contribute to that. Number one will be your root of title, the process of acquiring it, who transferred what to you, right? And even in some cases, when did you buy the land? So all these are things that court will look at. And if the root of title is defective, if somebody had bought from Mr. A, and Mr. A is such a person that does not have the authority or does not have that right for him to even transfer it to the buyer, right? It then means the buyer has bought nothing. Because if the rightful owner now comes with evidence that he is the one that has the right in the property, then the buyer will lose, and that's a capital loss.
Okay, thank you very much. Viewers, this has been quite informative, so we've been able to understand some important things about real estate as a real estate asset, as a property. So, sir, on a final note, what do you have to say to our viewers?
Yeah, I would say that real estate is an asset for each and everybody. Everyone is an investor, whether you like it or not. But it involves a lot of intricacies, complexities. So for anybody that wants to take real estate decision, either to buy or to sell, or to invest in any form, or to mortgage, whatever real estate decisions, try and consult your professional. Be rightly guided.
Thank you very much, sir. So on that note, viewers, we have come to the end of this first edition of Real Estate Services and Transactions. Until we see you again next time, my name is Oluwafemi Sanusi. Take care and bye-bye.